Hello, friends. Let's go. Different revolutions happen for completely different reasons. Mostly, these are situational causes, a lack of democratic freedoms, economic reasons, and so on. In the American Revolution, the overwhelming majority of causes were about money-pure economics. I did a deep dive into the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain in my episode, called The Boston Tea Party. Check it out using the link if you haven't seen it yet. Let's quickly summarize why this revolution happened. The American colonies were part of the British colonial empire. The King of England ruled over this entire colonial system, together with the British Parliament. For Britain, the colonies were economically very important. Specifically, North America supplied England with raw materials, which were processed there, and the finished goods were sent back to North America. The British Crown made money twice over. The North American colonies were booming, but their growth was being restricted. How? They couldn't trade with anyone except on British ships. Certain goods could only be exported through London to pay duties, and so on. This, of course, limited their industry. And Britain didn't want industry in America because why would you build your own factories and process raw materials if you could buy everything from us? The core policy of mercantilism was to maintain a positive balance of trade. Britain sold more abroad than it imported from overseas. This was the main economic doctrine for 2 centuries. Restricting industrial growth, limiting trade, and stationing British troops, it was all part of the policy. After the 7 Years' War, in which the British defeated the French, the troops weren't pulled out. The laws that restricted trade and industry were absolutely outrageous. For example, the Sugar Act practically destroyed rum distillation in America. The Stamp Act, which I talked about in the Boston Tea Party episode, taxed all printed materials. The final straw were the so-called Townshend Acts, which resulted in higher duties on tea, which was consumed in huge quantities. The Boston Tea Party became the peak moment of this economic confrontation. But there's another thing. Life in the colonies was really tough. On one hand, you had new land that needed to be developed. Indigenous people lived there who didn't want you taking their land. The climate conditions in different regions of North America were harsh, and the colonists had to work very hard to make a living. A person living in the colonies owned a gun because of the wilderness, the wild frontier, the taiga with grizzly bears. All of it required you to be constantly ready for a fight. As a result, these were fiercely independent people who said, "We provide for ourselves, and we don't want to pay any taxes, especially not to England." Why? Because Parliament represented all the classes of English society, but Americans had no representation there. So, when the colonies declared their independence in the Declaration, it would become very hard to raise money. We'll talk about that more later, but in general, the most important thing was the economy. Actually, the American bourgeoisie and political leaders didn't want this war. They delayed it as much as they could, trying to negotiate with the king. But King George III, the British king, was completely short-sighted, without getting too deep into his biography towards the end. He went mad, walking around his garden at the royal residence, giving orders to the left flank, to the right. Basically, he was a little off his rocker. He was later gently pushed out of power. But at the start of the events we're talking about, I believe he hadn't descended into madness yet. The king was, overall, weak and looked down on the colonists. That whole story about America being founded by Forfouron and all sorts of rabble convicts, the Irish and so on, who came up with that? The English did, who held this attitude towards the colonists, and the colonists, of course, knew about it. But most importantly, I'll say it again, it all started with the economy. The Boston Tea Party was the tipping point. As punishment for dumping those chests of tea, as punishment for not allowing the ships to be unloaded, the English passed intolerable acts. They were called the intolerable acts. The Americans, specifically, had the port of Boston shut down until compensation was paid for the destroyed tea. And that, essentially, became the peak of public outrage. On September 5, 1774, representatives from 12 American colonies gathered for the First Continental Congress to decide how to respond to the British. They needed to answer Britain's actions and came up with 3 key decisions. First, they drafted a petition to King George III, stating that his so-called intolerable acts were, in fact, intolerable. They demanded the repeal of these laws, arguing they were being restricted economically and legally, and called for a negotiated solution. The second decision was a boycott of British imports. They resolved to stop buying almost everything from England, with rare exceptions only for supplies needed for a potential army. The third crucial decision was to form and train an American militia, which would later become the Continental Army. When you say that America, the American colonies, are boycotting British goods, it sounds significant. But let's look at the numbers to understand the real impact. In 1774, Britain exported $5 million worth of goods to the northern colonies, an enormous sum for the time. The very next year, in 1775, that figure plummeted to just 200,000. You can imagine the devastating blow this dealt to the British economy, and naturally, the British were not happy about it. This Congress also featured the first major clash of interests that would eventually lead to the Civil War between the North and the South. We have a video on that topic on our channel as well. Please check it out. The northern and southern states had different economies, and their first major debates happened right there. It was also there that the Revolution's most famous phrase was born, one of the key slogans by Patrick Henry, the governor of Virginia: "Give me liberty or give me death." This would effectively become the motto of the Revolution. The king ignored the petition. Furthermore, he declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion. The British regular army was tasked with suppressing this revolt. While it wasn't an open war yet, British intelligence knew that a future Continental Army, currently just a militia or Minutemen, whatever you want to call it, was being trained. Warehouses were being stocked with gunpowder, bullets, and weapons. The following year, 1775, began with the British catching wind of these stockpiles in the town of Concord. Their goal was to destroy them. General Gage set out with a contingent of British Army units to, as they say, seize the supplies. This led to the first armed clash, as his troops didn't encounter peasants with pitchforks, but armed militia units who used open-order skirmish tactics. They began to shoot the British columns while they were on the march, leading to the first confrontation with casualties on both sides. The British were forced into a retreat back towards Boston, which, as we remember, was a blockaded port. This is where popular uprisings truly began to erupt. The beginning of the war for independence. On April 20th, the American militia, the colonists, surrounded Boston and laid siege to it, trapping the British Army inside. On May 10th, the Second Continental Congress convened, this time with all 13 colonies represented. Here, decisions were made acknowledging that war was imminent and needed to be pursued in earnest. The Americans understood they were outmatched. So, in June, they made one last attempt at peace. While the siege of Boston continued, the Continental Congress sent King George III the so-called Olive Branch Petition, essentially a peace offer. It proposed sitting down at the negotiating table to discuss the economic situation and the contentious laws, with the aim of repealing some and reaching an agreement. The king rejected this petition outright and formally declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion. They were now officially rebels. On June 15, 1775, the Continental Army was created and placed under the command of George Washington. He is the main hero of our story, a plantation owner and military man who had proven himself brilliantly during the French and Indian War. Washington was tasked with leading this army Neon, albeit reluctantly. When he accepted the position, he wrote that he did not believe himself to be the best candidate for the job. General Lee was considered, but his British origins were a mark against him. Nevertheless, Washington assumed command. It's important to discuss how this Continental Army was funded. In ancient times, when a king went to war, he summoned men who were his vassals. They, in turn, brought their own vassals, and the entire army went off to fight. But even then, an army needed funding. Horses had to eat, and soldiers needed to be clothed and equipped. Here, in the 18th century, farmers and colonists wouldn't just march off to war by decree. This was a contract army, with enlistment terms of just 30 to 60 days, and the men were paid for their service. So, how was this war financed? The young American Republic had no money. To paraphrase Vladimir Lenin, they had jack shit. So, they began printing paper money. Before this, the British had forbidden the colonies from printing their own currency, a major point of contention for American industrialists and the bourgeoisie. They started printing money, and by 1779, a staggering 241 million had been printed to fund the Continental Army. While that seems like a huge sum today, it was an astronomical figure for the time. However, despite this, the currency became virtually worthless. Each continental dollar was worth only 2 to 3 cents, and prices skyrocketed. There was a Soviet film called The Republic of Shkid that depicted pricing during the NAP, New Economic Policy era, where a grandmother goes to a bakery and asks how much the bread costs. They tell her, 22 million. Well, the exact same kind of prices existed back then. Obviously, a loaf of bread could cost hundreds of thousands, or tens of thousands of dollars. The inflation was wild, but nevertheless, the army began to be paid. One last economic point. Without the loans taken out by the continental government from France, the Netherlands, and Spain, there would have been no way to finance this war. And so, the war began. Let's talk about the tactical aspects. The British Army grew from 33,000 to 55,000 men after the fighting started. It was a well-armed, professional standing army. They had problems with cavalry, as it was difficult to transport horses across the ocean, so they had very little. The Americans also had little cavalry because it was expensive to maintain, and they had no money. Mixed light cavalry units were used, but they never became a dominant force on the battlefield. The British had a clear strategy: to cut off the New England colonies, split the colonists in two, and crush them piece by piece. It's important to note that when we talk about the North American colonies, not everyone was for independence. The Continental government never had the support of more than 45% of the population. A huge portion of American society, who became known as Loyalists, fought on the British side. Loyalists, plantation owners, slaveholders, and free farmers, a portion of them fought for the British. Native American tribes, with whom the British had signed a charter, also aided the British. There were even black battalions, consisting of African Americans, who fought on both sides of the conflict. Slaves were promised their personal freedom in exchange for valorous service. However, naturally, the majority of these slaves were later abandoned and never received their freedom. So, what was the American tactic? Honestly, at first they didn't have one. As we'll see, the Americans lost every major battle until the French arrived to help, and until a Prussian general, still a colonel at the time, came to train the army. The Americans lost all the major engagements. This doesn't mean George Washington was a bad commander. It's just that his army was untrained. There was no real regular army. It was essentially a people's militia. Everyone had a weapon. They used open-order skirmish lines, and they essentially waged guerrilla warfare. They ambushed British supply convoys, attacked isolated units, and conducted sudden flanking attacks. This is where the Americans excelled, as it's always difficult to counter guerrilla tactics. Remember the episode about the Boer War? Look how long it took the British to crush those unfortunate Boers. For nearly 2 years, they couldn't do anything against the partisans. The British couldn't employ the same scorched earth and special operations tactics in America because the territory was vast, and the colonists' resistance was quite significant. So, that's how the war began, a conflict between a professional army and American partisans. The first major victory for the Americans, well, major for them, of course it was huge for them. In actual fact, as you'll see, they captured Fort Ticonderoga. The Americans attacked this fort, which held an arsenal and weapons depot, and captured 120 cannons and guns. They were desperately short of supplies, but here they got their hands on 2 mortars and 10 tons of bullets. For them, this was a godsend, as they had never had such a quantity of weaponry before. They seized this British equipment from the fort, and the siege of Boston continued. In the second phase, the Americans came up with the idea of a preemptive attack on the British colonies in Canada. I think the entire modern rivalry between Canada and the United States really begins here, because a portion of the Loyalists would later flee to Canada. The Americans launched a 2-pronged invasion into Canada, aiming to defeat British forces there and prevent a second front from opening up. One column was led by Montgomery against Montreal, and the other by General Arnold against Quebec. Meanwhile, George Washington arrived outside Boston to take command of the siege operations. In September 1775, George Washington proclaimed the creation of a new Continental Army. An attempt to build a professional military force. He divided this army into 3 parts: the Northern Department, the Southern Department, and the main army. In total, he had about 18,000 men under his command, compared to the British, who had an estimated 30,000 to 40,000. It must be said that the American campaign in Canada was a complete failure. Initially, they scored some victories and managed to capture Fort Montreal. But it's important to understand that Montreal at the time wasn't the city you can stroll through today. It was a fortified stronghold, and Quebec was an even greater fortress. The fighting in Canada dragged on until the end of 1775. On December 31st, the Americans launched an all-out assault on the city of Quebec, which failed completely. They suffered enormous losses, and the Canadian campaign essentially ground to a halt. The British began a counter-offensive. At the same time, in February 1776, the war flared up in South Carolina. The British landed there. The British had another huge advantage over the Americans. They had the world's most powerful navy, which they used to bombard coastal fortifications and, crucially, for rapid troop deployment. By the beginning of 1776, the conflict had 3 major hotspots: the siege of Boston, which was going more or less successfully, the unsuccessful American campaign in Canada, the war in South Carolina. In Boston, things were going well. In March 1776, the Americans captured the dominant high ground overlooking the city. They began bombarding Boston with the cannons they had captured from Fort Ticonderoga. On March 17th, British troops evacuated Boston. Washington's elation was immense. It was a tremendous victory. And to this day, Evacuation Day is a celebrated holiday in Boston. The British retreat was a cause for celebration for the Americans. However, in Canada, the situation was very bad. By the summer of 1776, the British had completely driven the Americans out of Canada and liberated the territory. Nothing good was happening in South Carolina either. The British targeted Charleston, a major transportation hub protected by Fort Sullivan. The British fleet approached and bombarded it for 9 hours. The fort didn't surrender, but it was clear that nothing good awaited the Americans in South Carolina. By the summer of 1776, the Americans realized how difficult the war was. They were short on money and needed state loans. But how do you get a state loan? Who were they? They were just rebelling colonies. The Declaration of Independence. This brings us to the foundational document of American statehood, the Declaration of Independence, primarily authored by Thomas Jefferson. It was adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4, 1776. What was the purpose of this document? On one hand, we all understand that the Declaration of Independence was a proclamation that the North American colonies were now independent from the British Crown, which was true. But its main task was to announce to the world, listen up, we are not rebels. We are a new nation. This meant that England's enemies, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, could now formally sign treaties with this new state. They could provide financial aid, send armies, and deploy their navies. All of England's enemies were now potential friends, but the key point was that they were dealing with a sovereign state, not a group of insurgents. From this perspective, it was, of course, a vital document. The paradox is that the word independence itself does not appear in the Declaration of Independence. That's the first point. The second point, which would later be used to criticize the document, is its words about human freedom. To quote closely, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So all men are created equal." This is the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America. But there's a catch. Nothing is written in this declaration about slaves. This would later become a fundamental contradiction leading to the Civil War, because all men were free. But this did not apply to slaves or Native Americans, as they were not really considered men. Native Americans were a category of their own, and slaves were considered property. If we were to bring a Southern planter from 1775 into this studio and ask him, how could you do this? Thomas Jefferson himself was against slavery. Why did you exclude those words? You started writing a paragraph about black slaves in the Declaration. Why did you remove it? It's so unjust. He would likely say, well, listen, don't you understand? It's 1775. For us, slaves are property. They have no rights at all. You can sell them, buy them, like a cow. We can't write that cows are created equal, or parrots, or dogs. No, don't ask that about slaves. That's just how we see it. It sounds very cynical, but that's how it was. So, Jefferson did try to include a passage condemning slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but the guys from the southern states said, "No way, man. That's the foundation of our economy." And so, the document was presented to England's enemies. We are no longer rebels. We are a new nation. A few days later, on July 9th, they ceremoniously toppled a lead statue of King George III and melted it down to make bullets. The message was, you will get this statue back, English comrades, in the form of lead shot. Ideologically and morally, the Declaration of Independence was, of course, a monumental event that caused a national uplift. In practice, it was the foundational document for the formation of American statehood. Military campaigns of 1776. But the war was far from over. Because a declaration is just a piece of paper, you still have to fight with bayonets. And here, the second major hero of the war enters the stage, this time for the British. Lord Howe, a brilliant military commander. He decides to deal the Americans another blow in New York. In August 1776, he lands on Long Island, defeats the Americans, takes prisoners, and demoralizes the entire Continental Army. The Americans resorted to using privateers. There's even a document showing that the Continental Congress made a deal with what were essentially pirates. We grant you the authority, we hire you to attack British ships, and please send 50 of the prize money to our treasury. There's no physical evidence, but such an agreement existed. The Americans' own navy was small and attempted similar guerrilla-style raids on British ships, but these efforts were largely unsuccessful. As a result, the fleet they had managed to build over the summer was essentially wiped out on September 11, 1776. The British destroyed the American fleet near Valcour Island on Lake Champlain, burning and crushing it, roughly speaking, in the vicinity of New York. For the Americans, the story in September was one of relentless defeat. Howe beats them at Lower Manhattan, then captures Fort Washington. The Americans are in retreat, and the entire army realizes that whenever a major, set-piece battle occurs, they lose. The great retreat of George Washington's army begins. He escapes across the Delaware River, and the British fail to press their advantage. Here, Lord Howe makes a strategic error. Instead of crossing the Delaware River, he hesitates. It's now November. He fears the oncoming frost, disease, freezing temperatures, and the challenge of supplying his horses. So he does not pursue Washington across the river. He could have taken Philadelphia and probably ended the entire campaign right there. But the British return to New York, and overall, 1776 ends very, very badly for the Americans. The winter proves brutal for George Washington's army. First, the enlisted men, whose contracts are expiring, begin to desert and head home. There's no money, and winter camp is extremely harsh. Nevertheless, a remnant of the army holds on until January. Washington crosses the river again, attacks the British at Princeton, and wins a huge boost for morale. However, this victory at Princeton brings no strategic advantage. The Americans retreat back across the Delaware River, and the British continue to hold to their tactics. Meanwhile, in the spring of 1777, Washington tries to raise a new army, recruiting men, and somehow, by hook or by crook, he manages to do it. But I repeat, this army has no formal training. It's learning to fight on the battlefield, and of course, this is an incredibly difficult situation. Benjamin Franklin and diplomacy. One important event worth highlighting separately is the dispatch of Benjamin Franklin to Paris. He was another key figure of the American Revolution, a plantation owner, thinker, even a philosopher and physicist. His epitaph reads that he snatched the lightning from the sky and the scepter from tyrants, a man with a brilliant sense of humor, a stunning polemicist and negotiator. It was he, in fact, who famously said of the British, "When has it ever been seen that an island should govern a continent?" This became a foundational quip of the War for Independence. He was sent to Paris to negotiate an alliance with the French king against the British. The French had just lost the 7 Years' War to the British, and Benjamin Franklin told them, "Come on, guys, support us. Strike a blow against the English. You'll get moral and material compensation. Join the war on our side." These negotiations began just as things on the front were not going well. Lord Howe was chasing Washington's army, returning to New York, leaving New York, beating Washington, and returning again. This continued until June 1727. In August, Lord Howe deceived George Washington. He loaded his troops onto ships, landed at the mouth of the Delaware River, and marched on Philadelphia. Washington didn't expect this. Meanwhile, a second British army set out from another location, moving toward Albany. Thus, two American armies found themselves squeezed. With the British on one side, the American army began to engage in the battles for Saratoga. In the First Battle of Saratoga, the British commander lost 10 of his army. The second battle ended in complete disaster. On October 11, 1777, Due to failed field maneuvers, the British found themselves surrounded near Saratoga, and 6,000 soldiers of the British Army, the lobsterbacks, as they were called for their red coats, surrendered and were taken prisoner. This was an absolute catastrophe for the British, especially since everything had been going so well for them until then. Meanwhile, on October 4th, the Battle of Germantown took place, where the Americans were soundly defeated, their army fleeing. General Stephen, who commanded on the American side, was reportedly engrossed in drunkenness. Washington relieved him of his command, stating that he had led the campaign while drunk. This was a terrible moral collapse in the general staff, a horrific disaster for the army. And this was compensated for a month later by the British being surrounded at Saratoga, marking the first time a British force, and such a large one at 6,000 men, had surrendered. What did this lead to? There was no email, as you understand, no telephones, so news traveled across the ocean very slowly. In December, the news that the British had suffered such a monstrous defeat 2 months prior finally reached Paris. The King of France realized that the American cause wasn't hopeless. They are beating the British even without us. If we both enter the conflict now, of course we'll clobber the British. And for us, it's not just about North America and regaining some of our lands, but most importantly, we can take care of the British in the Caribbean right now. Baron von Steuben and the reorganization of the army negotiations are underway in Paris. While back in America, a brutal winter sets in. In December, Washington's army camps at Valley Forge. It is a hard winter, a terrible winter. But it is here that another hero of this war appears, known as Baron von Steuben, full name, Friedrich Wilhelm Augustin, Ludolf Gerhard von Steuben. He was a Prussian military officer who had fought in the 7 Years' War, was captured by the Russians, and spent time as a prisoner of war in Russia. From 1762, he served as an aide-de-camp to the Prussian king Frederick the Great. He arrives in America and enlists in the Continental Army. He's known to be a good, professional Prussian officer who actually knows how to build an army. George Washington is informed of this and brings him onto his staff. He becomes, let's say, a consultant, a military inspector, even though such a rank didn't officially exist yet. According to Baron von Steuben's own memoirs, George Washington's army was not an army, but a rabble. The men had no discipline. They didn't know what to do on the battlefield. And so, Steuben begins to drill George Washington's army. As the saying goes, he personally positions them with his own hands and voice. They march for him, learn flanking maneuvers, movements from the rear guard to the vanguard, and so on. The following year, in 1778, he would begin compiling the first manual for the American Army, which would be called the Blue Book. It was a field manual, a garrison and parade manual, a cavalry manual, and a manual for light infantry units. That first winter, he writes the first part of this book. Later, this book would effectively become the Army's first official manual. According to U.S. documents and the memoirs of contemporaries, it became the most popular book after the Bible. It was reprinted as late as 1809. Steuben trains the American Army, and frankly, he gets pretty good results in such a short time. Over a winter of a few months, he forges something resembling a regular army. Meanwhile, in Paris, the northern colonies achieve their first major diplomatic success. A treaty of cooperation, trade, and military assistance is signed. On March 13, 1728, France notified England that it had signed such a treaty with the northern colonies. England immediately declared war on France. A portion of the British Parliament was against this war. In the English Parliament, questions were raised. Why do we need another war in Europe? Why should we spend a huge amount of money? There was a brilliant speech by Lord William Pitt, who said that in order not to lose the colonies, they must be prepared to fight the whole world, to not yield an inch to any European country. He became so agitated that a few minutes after his speech, he suffered a heart attack. At this time, Lord Howe, who commanded the army on the northern continent, was under heavy criticism. He resigns and is replaced by General Clinton. General Clinton understands that after Saratoga and the surrender of the British Army, they need to pull themselves together. He abandons Philadelphia and begins to devise a new strategy for the war against George Washington's Continental Army. It must be said that the French, especially among the young nobility, who were influenced by Enlightenment ideas, greatly sympathized with the Americans. The idea of a republic, of throwing off the yoke of monarchy, was flourishing among the young French aristocracy. The Marquis de Lafayette and his role in the war. One of the most brilliant representatives of this French nobility was Gilbert de Motier. As history knows him, he entered the annals as Lafayette. On June 15, 1757, he sailed to America, landing near Charleston, and immediately penned an appeal to the Continental Congress, asking to be accepted into the American Army as a simple volunteer. Moreover, he was prepared to equip an entire division at his own expense. Lafayette, being a marquis, was given a post on the Army's staff. In reality, he became a senior aide-de-camp to George Washington, and the two formed a very strong friendship. Lafayette began to take part in all the major battles. Why is his story worth telling separately? He lived for 77 years, and history has such figures who seem to participate in every significant event of their time. Lafayette would fight in the American Army for practically the entire war, with more or less success. He later contracted pneumonia and was sent back to France to recuperate in 1778. In France, he instantly became the most fashionable man. Queen Marie Antoinette, who would later lose her head, made him her favorite, presented him to the king, and he was given the rank of colonel in the Royal Grenadiers. He became the chief lobbyist for the American cause, urging the French court to send a fleet and supplies to fight the British. After the Americans won the war, he would make a triumphal tour of American cities, becoming a national hero before returning to France. Back in France, he would be swept up in the Great French Revolution and become the commander of the National Guard. He was the most popular law enforcement figure in France and would lead the National Guard on the march to Versailles. Lafayette was an opponent of the absolute monarchy. When the king attempted to flee Paris, it was a personal blow to him, as the revolutionaries accused him of treason, stating, "He spent his whole life telling everyone he was a hero of the American Revolution, and then he let the king escape." Robespierre would demand his execution, and he was persecuted throughout the revolution. He was arrested by the Austrians and claimed he was not a French citizen. The Austrians, being allies of the French king, arrested him as a revolutionary and a traitor. He declared that he wasn't even French, he had an American passport, and George Washington would fight for his release. The Austrians retorted that they did not recognize America and never would. He spent 5 years in prison. After his release, he returned to France, which was now under Napoleon. Napoleon wrote him a letter, to which Lafayette replied that people had pinned their hopes for liberation on him, but he was becoming an authoritarian ruler. Then came Napoleon's disastrous Russian campaign, his defeat, his loss of the crown, and his exile. During the famous 100 Days when Napoleon returned, the first person he offered a post to was Lafayette. Lafayette refused. We all know what happened to Napoleon next. Lafayette would speak about the Restoration and the need to restore the monarchy in France. He supported Louis-Philippe d'Orléans to become king. When this restoration occurred, he once again became the head of the National Guard. He had a similar falling out with Louis-Philippe, as he had with the French revolutionaries and Napoleon. At a certain point, he saw that Louis-Philippe was unprepared for any real reforms. He wrote scathing letters and delivered angry speeches. Louis-Philippe, in general, couldn't do anything to him because Lafayette was immensely popular. Nevertheless, he was distanced from the court. Furthermore, in 1831, during the Polish uprising, he wrote letters arguing that France should raise money and an army to fight for Poland against the Russians. That is, against the troops of Emperor Nicholas the Morse, and that France should enter the war. France did not go to war, but by the end of his days, he had also quarreled with this king and died at his estate. My point is this: over 77 years, firstly, people didn't usually live that long back then, and secondly, he managed to participate in absolutely everything. That was the kind of man the Marquis de Lafayette was. When he died, he was given a military funeral, attended by a huge number of people. In America, both houses of Congress hung black flags for 30 days, and congressmen wore mourning bands. Former U.S. President John Quincy Adams delivered a 3-hour speech in honor of Lafayette's death, stating that this man was at the head of that list of pure and disinterested benefactors of the human race. France enters the war. Now, let's return to the American front. France's official entry into the war against England was, without a doubt, a huge diplomatic victory for the Americans. However, the situation on the battlefield was still not great. On June 28, 1798, at the Battle of Monmouth, the Americans suffered another defeat. General Charles Lee, a popular American commander, was relieved of his command for his poor performance during the battle, solidifying Washington's position as the primary political and military leader of the United States. A French naval squadron entered the Delaware Bay, bringing weapons and a large quantity of uniforms. Washington, in coordination with this fleet, attempted to assault New York, but the attack never materialized. Nevertheless, the Americans received a crucial infusion of military supplies, clothing, and weaponry. Thus, 1778 ended, and a relative stalemate settled over the main fronts until the following spring. For the most part, 1779 was marked by local skirmishes. The British General Clinton attacked American forces and captured Fort Lafayette, formerly Fort Paulus. Essentially, the campaign in that region was concluded. On June 21, 1779, England gained a new enemy. Spain declared war and immediately dispatched its fleet to raid English colonies. A separate event worth mentioning occurred later that summer. This is a tragic story that entered history as the Sullivan Expedition. It effectively became a foundational event in the long struggle of Native Americans for their rights. As mentioned before, some Native American tribes, notably the Iroquois Confederacy, aided the British and harassed the Continental Army with guerrilla tactics, stealing horses, burning supply wagons, and so on. At a certain point, a decision was made to launch a punitive campaign. In June 1779, American General John Sullivan led a raid on Iroquois villages and settlements, burning everything to the ground and killing inhabitants. The exact number of casualties is unknown, but it is considered one of the bloodiest American punitive operations against Native peoples in the war. This was arguably the most significant and dark event of 1779. Washington's army once again went into winter quarters. The continental dollar was rapidly depreciating. The following year, in January 1780, the Spanish fully entered the conflict. The governor of Spanish Louisiana, Bernardo de Galvez, began a campaign into British West Florida and captured it by May, successfully driving the British out. International relations and the armed neutrality. The next major event occurred in July 1780, when a French army under the command of the Comte de Rochambeau sailed to America and landed in Newport. The British attempted to counter this move diplomatically. They announced that they would sink any merchant vessels heading to North America, regardless of whether they carried weapons, grain, or medicine. Their message was, "We will sink everything." While France and Spain were acknowledged enemies, this policy also targeted neutral countries. Britain was essentially forbidding them from trading with America. The most important of these neutral countries was the Russian Empire. Initially, the British had asked Catherine the Great to provide them with Russian soldiers to send to America and help fight the colonists. Catherine refused. Then, after the British Parliament passed its law authorizing the sinking of neutral merchant ships, the Russian official in charge of foreign policy, Count Panin, whether it was his own idea or on the instruction of Empress Catherine, proclaimed the League of Armed Neutrality. Sweden and Denmark joined Russia in this league. Catherine was essentially telling London, "Our ships will sail to America escorted by warships. If you attack them, we will attack your vessels. We will not allow you to sink our merchant fleet." There was significant intrigue behind this move. For instance, Potemkin, accompanied by the British ambassador, had urged Catherine to help the British. Panin, on the other hand, believed in assisting the Americans, arguing that the British had consistently opposed Russian interests. After much internal debate, the League of Armed Neutrality was formed, and Russian ships began to trade with America, making a tangible contribution to the American war effort. The betrayal of Benedict Arnold. In September 1780, another critical event unfolded. George Washington was traveling to meet with the French General Rochambeau to discuss joint operations against the British Army, and nearly ended up captured by the English. He was betrayed by an American general, Benedict Arnold. Arnold had previously distinguished himself during the Canadian campaign in quotes, because that campaign was a failure for the Americans. He had since become a spy for the British. How did this happen? He had been accused of embezzlement and couldn't properly account for the funds he had received for his army's expenses. The first time, he talked his way out of it, claiming he lacked an accountant and that with so many transactions, he could account for some funds, but not others, as he didn't know where they had gone. The second time, he was formally charged with misconduct and faced a court-martial. In response, he made a deal with the British to hand over George Washington for money. He informed the British of Washington's travel plans to meet with Rochambeau, but the plot was uncovered. The details of how it was discovered only came to light in the 1930s, roughly 150 years later. It turns out George Washington had established a spy network known as the Culper Ring. All agents operating in America had code names like 711, 712. No one knew who was part of this network. This ring closely monitored British movements, reporting on troop deployments, supply depot locations, and the orders being issued. It is believed that the most crucial agent, whose identity remains the only one from the ring not fully confirmed, was Agent 355. Rumors suggest she was a socialite in New York who managed to gain the trust of British generals. She was the one who reported that General Arnold had turned traitor and had disclosed Washington's travel plans, thereby saving him. The true identity of this woman remains unknown to this day, but the Culper Ring is considered a supremely important spy network in American history. The Southern Campaign. The Southern colonies had a large number of loyalists people who remained loyal to the British Crown. For the most part, American plantation owners in the South supported England because of the mutually beneficial trade, including the slave trade, and their economic ties. Back in November 1778, a British army of 3,500 men was sent to Savannah, but they failed to subdue Georgia at that time. In 1799, an attempt to besiege Charleston also failed, after which the British began to wage a fairly successful campaign in the region. However, in the summer of 1779, they ran into major problems. A French fleet arrived off the coast of Georgia and laid siege to the city of Savannah, maintaining the siege until September. But with the onset of winter, the fleet withdrew. The British then transferred an additional 8,500 troops from New York to the south, launching a phenomenal campaign in 1780. In May, they defeated an American army and captured 5,500 soldiers. By summer, they had captured virtually all of South Carolina. The Americans attempted to counterattack and fought a major battle at Camden, but the American army was defeated, and the British pressed forward, beginning an invasion of North Carolina. As is evident, the Americans lost almost every major set-piece battle. A turning point came in the fall, in October 1780. The Americans managed to halt the British advance. They assembled a new force, drawing some troops from the northern states, and defeated the British at the Battle of Kings Mountain. This victory sparked an American counteroffensive, but winter set in, pausing major operations until the following year. The full-scale American counteroffensive in the South resumed in 1781. The first major battle was at Guilford Courthouse. While the British technically won the field, they lost 7 of their army in the process. It became clear that the British would be unable to hold the South. After a series of subsequent engagements, by the fall of 1781, the British held only 3 key towns in South Carolina: Savannah, Charleston, and Wilmington. Essentially, the Southern campaign was also lost for the British. Here, it's worth making a brief aside, because the war was not being fought only on the North American continent. The War in the West Indies. The war was also being waged in the British colonies of the West Indies, where the economic situation was highly precarious. The West Indian colonies depended on food supplies from North America, and in turn, traded sugar and indigo with the mainland colonies. When the war began, these economic ties were severed, leading to anti-British uprisings on the islands. These rebellions were promptly supported with money and ships by the French, Spanish, and Dutch. The Dutch, unwilling to accept the loss of their colonial influence, supported any rebellion against the British. In 1778, France went on the offensive in the Caribbean theater. A constant naval war raged between the British and French fleets over islands like St. Vincent, St. Lucia, and Grenada. The French conducted this campaign quite successfully. In 1779, the French joined forces with the Spanish and nearly captured a key island, likely Jamaica. What saved the British from losing Martinique was an outbreak of epidemic disease among the forces, followed by tropical storms and fires that plagued both sides. As mentioned, the Dutch supported all the rebels, which ultimately led to the British declaring war on the Dutch in 1781. The British felt that being at war with France and Spain wasn't enough, and now they had a conflict with the Dutch in the colonies as well. This particular war would, in the end, prove successful for the British. The Siege of Gibraltar. Now we enter the final stage of the War for Independence. But before we conclude the story of the American War, we must recount another crucial battle that took place far from the North American continent. As I mentioned, the Spanish had entered the war. Having lost nearly everything in the 7 Years' War, they were desperate to regain something. For them, the primary target was what they called the Rotten Tooth, the British military base at Gibraltar. In 1779, the Spanish, together with the French, laid siege to Gibraltar. This would become a multi-year ordeal. Gibraltar was virtually impregnable. The siege involved constant bombardments, multiple lines of trenches, and attempts to tunnel beneath the city's defenses. However, while Gibraltar was cut off by land, British ships continually managed to slip through the blockade by sea to supply the garrison with food and provisions. At one point, the French and Spanish constructed the world's first floating batteries. The plan was to sail these fortified vessels right up to the fortress walls and blast the outer British defenses. However, as often happened, the batteries were delayed due to equipment problems. When they were finally ready, they were massive wooden structures that were maneuvered to point-blank range against the fortress. The British, realizing these ships were highly vulnerable, began using heated shot, cannonballs heated until red-hot in a furnace and then loaded into cannons. With these red-hot projectiles, they set fire to and destroyed half of the Spanish floating batteries. The siege dragged on, lasting until 1782. Lord Howe, whom I mentioned at the beginning of our story, who had been recalled from North America and had resigned, was given a new command. He led a relief fleet and, under the cover of a thick fog, managed to enter the Gibraltar Strait, scatter the combined French and Spanish fleet, and break the siege. For this feat, he was celebrated as a hero in British songs and ballads. The Spanish, unfortunately, gained nothing from this part of the war. Final battles and surrender. In December 1780, the British attempted to deliver a final crushing blow. A British army landed and raided Richmond, Virginia. In response, George Washington sent a force of about 1,200 men under the command of the Marquis de Lafayette. The ensuing campaign was difficult for Lafayette. The following year, in 1781, the British sent 2,500 troops to Portsmouth, and Lafayette was defeated at the Battle of Green Spring. He was nearly captured himself and was forced to retreat. The British proceeded to wreak havoc in Virginia, a state that had been largely spared from the war until then, due to its valuable tobacco plantations. The phrase, "the house is burning, so let the barn burn too," captures the scorched earth nature of the raids. Meanwhile, the British committed their last reserves to the fighting in the Carolinas and Georgia, where battles raged throughout the year. The tide finally turned on August 14, 1781. The combined armies of George Washington and the French General Rochambeau arrived in Virginia. They defeated the British in the crucial Battle of the Chesapeake, a naval victory that sealed the fate of the British Army on land, and then laid siege to the main British base at Yorktown. They cut it off from reinforcements and sent 2 demands for surrender. After the British rejected these ultimatums, General Cornwallis finally signed the Articles of Capitulation on October 17th, and the British Army surrendered. 1782 was the final year of the war. The situation in Britain was dire. In March, Parliament voted to begin peace negotiations. The Crown's last major army had been lost in Virginia. The British government was bankrupt, saddled with enormous debts, and a crippling shortage of money and manpower. Most critically, the Royal Navy, stretched to its limits, was forced to fight not only in North America, but also against the French in the Caribbean. The French had captured St. Martin and St. Kitts and nearly seized Jamaica. A massive naval battle, the largest of the 18th century, took place near the Saintes Islands. The British fleet defeated the French there and saved Jamaica, but the Crown's finances were exhausted. King George III still wanted to continue the fight. Parliament, seeking a way out, proposed a temporary truce with the Americans, suggesting, "Your Majesty, let us sign a provisional ceasefire with the Americans, and then, at a later date, we can resume the war." The king agreed to this plan. However, as we now know, this temporary truce would become permanent, and the king would later dissolve Parliament in frustration after realizing he had been misled. The conclusion of the Paris Peace Treaty. Despite American skepticism that genuine peace talks would materialize, separate negotiations between the Americans and the British began in November 1782. These talks culminated the following year with the signing of the Treaty of Paris on September 3, 1783. On November 25th, British troops ceremoniously evacuated New York, their last stronghold in the United States. George Washington triumphantly entered the city. Afterwards, he traveled to Philadelphia and then to Annapolis, where the Congress was seated. There, in a deeply symbolic act, he formally resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. The war was won. What were the consequences? For Britain, it was a staggering political and moral defeat. Vast financial resources had been poured into the war with nothing to show for it. The British were effectively forced to abandon their ambition of creating a vast, consolidated colonial empire in North America, though they still retained many other colonies worldwide. After losing America, the British shifted their imperial focus to India, concentrating on securing their holdings there to prevent a similar revolution. India would remain under their control for a long time to come. A second consequence was that the British began to reform their army, lessons which ultimately helped them in the subsequent Napoleonic Wars. France, for its part, gained several Caribbean islands. However, the cost of the war plunged the French crown into a massive financial crisis, a key factor that led to the French Revolution, the overthrow of the monarchy, and the execution of the king. Ironically, within 100 years, France would again become a major political influence in the Americas. The aftermath of the war. The most significant issues left in the wake of the war were that the 13 states were, in practice, 13 independent countries. What would their relationship be with the central government? Where would the authority of the central government end and the powers of the individual states begin? These unresolved questions would eventually lead to the Civil War. The issue of slavery also remained unaddressed, and this fundamental contradiction between the North and the South would persist. Speaking of casualties, the numbers are estimated differently across various sources. In many accounts, the American losses were the highest in percentage terms of any war the U.S. has fought. They lost approximately 25,000. England lost 15,000 by one estimate, and up to 43,000 by another, when including deaths from disease and scurvy. Disease was a massive killer, with smallpox being the greatest horror. The British began inoculating their troops against smallpox, and it is to George Washington's credit that he mandated the inoculation of American soldiers, as many Americans were resistant. There were anti-vaxxers even then, who argued it was a terrible idea and that vaccines should not be used. But in the end, the army was inoculated, and it saved them. Spain lost about 5,000 men, the French lost 10,000, and even the Dutch lost 500. Those were the war's human costs. But the most important outcome was that a new independent nation appeared on the world map, the United States of America. Its first president would be George Washington, the most popular politician, a man whose portrait we have all seen many times. Of course, his most famous depiction is on the dollar bill. Here's a small historical note. You can see his face looks somewhat stern, with a jaw that juts forward, making him seem like he's looking down on everyone. But in reality, dentistry at the time was very primitive, and George Washington lost his teeth very early. The dentures he was fitted with distorted the shape of his face and are the reason for his distinctive, tight-lipped expression in portraits. Interesting facts about the war. As we wrap up the story of the Revolutionary War, it's worth noting that the first known instance of a body being identified by its teeth also took place during this conflict. When the decomposed body of an officer was presented for identification, no one could recognize him. A dentist then said, "Open his mouth. Oh, that's my filling. I know who this is. I put it in." So, it was the first case of dental identification. And if Washington lost his own teeth, America, in a sense, got hers, and she would bear them to the world over the next few centuries. And that was the story of the American War of Independence. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and see you next time.